and then a lot of students who've also helped, Dr. Sebastian Cardona, who did a little bit of mapping in the Albion down here, as well as the software contributors, Schlumberger and Geoterric, and all of my colleagues. I mentioned Ken Niblink, but you know, Tim Demko, people from Exxon, all of my local colleagues down there who have just facilitated and sort of all these conversations going on about this area. And there are elephants in northeastern South America. I want to talk today a little bit about the origin and evolution of some of the big feeder systems down there that are feeding these big submarine fans, and talk a little bit about some of the discoveries and opportunities in offshore Guyana and Suriname. So let's talk first about what an elephant looks like down there, and then we're going to explore what I call the trunk, which are the big cross-elephant-sized valleys that are feeding, literally feeding the rest of these elephants. Okay. In case you don't know, just to locate you, Guyana and Suriname were a little bit late to the party of elephant discoveries. This is an image from Horn's 2004 paper on sort of giant fields from 1868 to 2004. And you can see the yellow dots in here that are looking at different giant fields. And an elephant field is considered a giant field with more than 500 million barrels of oil. So if you look over to the right, I should pull up a pointer. That would be something that an expert would do, wouldn't it? I don't really like that pointer. I'm going to do this because I have a hard time not drawing when I'm doing something. If you look around over here, this is the area we're talking about over in Suriname and Guyana offshore. And this is the Columbus Basin. Some of you may be familiar with. BHP is really active out there. There's a lot of success in Amoco, or not Amoco anymore, BP Trinidad and Tobago, and BHP out in there, and some other companies recently talking about discoveries out there. Then we're over into the big Venezuelan province over in here, and then the Colombia province, and then Central America. So we're going to look forward to the east today, and we're going to talk about the area of Guyana. This is Guyana, and I've written a couple of puzzles, go out and do some field work, and then I realized that I'm arachnophobic, and there's probably a whole lot of spiders living in this jungle. And so I've decided I'm going to send a bunch of students out there to do a bunch of work and have them report back to me frequently. It is a beautiful country. It sits on the northern edge of the Amazon rainforest. The other thing that Guyana is really known for, the Guyana-Suriname area, is gold deposits. This is just taken off of one of the gold company's websites, and you can see that there's quite a lot of mining in this area, quite a lot of gold deposits. And of course, where would we be without the ubiquitously disputed eastern border between Venezuela and Guyana? All the companies that have tried to do seismic shoots out here, they're familiar with this area, and they're quite familiar with the Venezuelan gunboats. So it's quite a busy area. If we look at this, it is a mega hydrocarbon province. And I think that one of the things, and I'll talk about later, but one of the things that drove us there was actually the ODP and ILDP programs. A lot of people had talked about this area for quite a while. Shell had been the most active company out in this area. And if you look right through here is the border between Suriname and Guyana, with Suriname on the right and Guyana on the left. And because geology respects no borders, there's discoveries on either side. But if you look in this area, Shell had drilled wells in the 1970s, along with Dimenex, where they had drilled what they called the Essequibo 1 and Essequibo 2 wells. And as regard to, we were talking about this earlier, this was some of the earliest source rock information that came out of this area. And this was some of the source rock information that suggested that there were these graben structures, that were potentially full of sort of terrestrial tending source rock. We now know that that's just a small piece after, as I said, the IODP and ODP work that was done out there on the Demerara platform, and I'll talk about that. But these Shell and Dimenex tested some growth fault plays. There were growth fault plays in here near the shelf margin. The Mahaka 1 and 2 were shale wells that were drilled in 74, and they tested what they thought were carbonate reef plays sitting out in here. And then the first well that really brought oil to surface was the Ibari 1 well, drilled by Shell. And this is sort of a general log of the Ibari 1 well. You can see there's lots of carbonates and clastics mixed in here, but the Ibari 1 was the first well to really come up and bring hydrocarbon to surface. I will tell you this. So this line that you're looking at here is from the Repsol data. And you can see the basement rock down here at base. I'll show you there's some carbonate, what we believe are some carbonate mound developments in here. And then this huge prograding system of clastics that's moving off the shelf. Subsequently, post-Cretaceous, this prograding system of clastics continues, but the processes bringing sediments into the post-Cretaceous are a little bit different than within the Cretaceous, and we'll talk about that. So if we look, this is an area that companies love because there is no one play that's successful in here. As we figured out, there are trains of elephants in here. The playing field is really a myriad of different types of plays, some of which have been tested at this point, and some of which have not been tested. Exxon and their partners have been playing up in here in the Cretaceous turbidite complexes. The work that we did was specifically looking a lot at this Cretaceous system in here, the shelf edge feeders, the prograding, aggregating nature of the system. There's a lot of play going on up in the upper parts, the post-Cretaceous parts of the basin, looking by the rest of the world, meaning Tullow, and Hess is also engaged with Tullow, as they are with Exxon out here, and some other companies that are involved in exploration discovery out there, including Repsol. The real explorers are going to be playing around down here deeper. There's a huge Cretaceous sedimentary wedge of material that sits down here over the rifted Jurassic, synrifted, and rifted basement. And so these were, as I'll show you, these were being fed by big systems that were coming out of the rift that was developing between South America and Africa. So if we look in a little more schematic way at that sedimentation, and we're going to do one slide to look at the tectonic history in here, you can see this early Jurassic, sort of Triassic, Jurassic age rifting that was really associated with what was the rifting apart of the Northern Atlantic down into the areas of the Proto-Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. So you had this sort of southward progression of rifting that was going on, that was separating Laurasia, the Gondwana land separation, and generating a rifted grabens all along what would become the coast of Suriname and Guyana. The question of what these are filled with is, I'll show you a slide of some work that people have done about question of what these rifts are filled with, and some images that we've done down in here. So if we look at this, we have plays going on down in here. After we rifted apart this system, then we began to see a counterclockwise rotation of Africa, and it impinged or collided with the Northeastern South America area. And so that's what caused the uplift of a common feature down here, the Demerara Plateau, and its conjugate margin feature, the Guinea Plateaus on the African margin. You saw inversions of these older Jurassic age grabens and deformation, and you saw an uplift and a penaplanation of the entire Guyana Suriname basin and the Apti and Albion. I'll show you a seismic line that shows that. It's amazing. It's very similar to, some of the mountains that we see in southern Colorado, sort of in terms of size and scale of these things. So that was a whole different, and this is the Staubrook area, what a lot of people have been playing down in there and having great success at. Then we began to see in the later Cretaceous, more the Albion time, we began to see a lot of development of reefs and carbonate systems and things. And so we laid down several different source rocks in here, and we laid down several different reservoir types. You'll notice that in the upper image up in here, you can see that after the collision and the uplift and truncating off of some of these mountains and uplifts, we began to separate out and release that stress. We began to see the drift phase of Africa and South America drifting away from what is largely this transform fault system coming through. And we began to develop a big rifted graben in here. We began to deposit sediments on down through here. And we began to see in the late Cretaceous what would begin to look like the traditional Northeastern South American margin. The thing that amazes me is, we have huge river systems developed today, present day, the Amazon, the Orinoco river systems, but there were huge river systems that preceded the Amazon that were probably flowing out through some of these older rifted structures that were feeding the Burbees continent, or the Burbees continental margin, and burying these source rocks and generating hydrocarbons during this time. So the latter part of the talk, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this section, but let me show you a couple of images. The older stuff, I mentioned the Sin Rift reservoirs that are very deep, sitting down on top of, that's this stuff in here, sitting down on top of the rifted basement. We have done a little bit of work in there in the seismic looking at these. You can see in here that there are these large scale sort of sediment pathways that are confined within these about 50-kilometer wide, what appear to be sort of rifted sediment fairways. These smaller, I call them smaller, 10 to 12 sort of kilometer scale sediment pathways. I'm assuming they're subaerial channel systems, but I haven't done enough work to confirm it yet. There are definitely axial systems. There are some suggestions that there's a few transverse systems coming in here. The sediments feeding down these axial rift systems would tend to be better sorted, more mature than those in the transverse systems. So there is a clastic play that's very deep down here off the Guianan coast and off the Suriname coast that hasn't really been explored yet. I mentioned that following this rifting phase, we began to rotate Africa around and collide it with Northeastern South America. That resulted in the uplift of the Demerara Plateau. And this is a seismic line that goes sort of southwest to northeast. So it's trending sort of like this across the Demerara Plateau. And you can see the drill site, the IODP drill site that sets in here, one of the ones that proved up the Cinnamonian Santonian source rock that was in here. That source rock has over 30% total organic carbons, and it has just ubiquitously really high organic carbons, anywhere from 1 to 7 to 13% organic carbons. So it is a true world-class source rock that sets up and enables charging of once it gets buried through the maturation windows by these big sediment supply systems that are coming in at different times in the basin, it begins to set up the maturation. The thing I want you to notice is look at this erosional surface across the Demerara Plateau. That erosional surface, I call it the Demerara Mountains. That erosional surface is visually probably not that dissimilar in size and height to the San de Cristo Mountains in Colorado and Mexico. Those San de Cristo Mountains set on the eastern side of the rifted basin that impinge upon southern Colorado and northern New Mexico. Those sort of Quaternary age or tertiary age rifts. And that's a good sort of visual analogy to what you had going on in the Cretaceous when you impacted and you inverted this structure and built these mountain fronts that were feeding sediments off into the associated basins along the northeastern margin and even along the southwestern margin of northwestern margin of Africa. If we look at the thing that everyone talks about down here, the Mobile discoveries in the Staubrook block, to date, Mobile has 18 discoveries. Now then, that was to date about a month ago. Every time I change the television channel, Mobile has another discovery. I mean, ExxonMobil has another discovery down there. They're partnered with Hess in these blocks. They've also partnered with another company to work the Kanje blocks out here. And there's going to be some interesting things come out of that. 18 discoveries, 8 billion barrels recoverable in Staubrook alone. The production is expected to rise to about 1 million barrels of oil per day over 10 years. Just in comparison, Norway produces about 2 million barrels per day, the entire country. In reality, this is 1 million barrels a day is about 450 barrels of oil per day per person that lives in Guyana. I mean, you could take 1 barrel of oil per day at $50 a barrel, and you could give it 1 barrel a day to each person in Guyana, and it would give them an annual income of about $15,000 a year, which is just shocking for, compared to what goes on in the populace and what the earning power is in the Guyanan populace today. So I'm hope that this will truly influence the social development of Guyana and Suriname both, and the populations down there. Hopefully, this will incentivize and build some economy down there to a country that hasn't had a lot of economy. The Liza Phase 1 operation started in December 2019. The Liza 2 is going to add another 220 billion barrels of oil, 220,000 barrels of oil per day. The Parara development is going to add, about that 220,000 barrels. It costs about $9 billion. The Parara development, it's already been approved. So they're hoping, just Exxon is hoping to produce 750,000 barrels per day by 2025. Hess claims that their break-even cost down there is $35 a barrel. So there's a reason in COVID environments in this time that everyone is running to their primary assets. I mean, these are huge elephant discoveries that are going to mean financial stability for a lot of these companies and a lot of these countries for a very, very long time. And you have only scratched the surface of what is down there. If we look at an image of the Guyana and Western Continental Slope plays, that's what's being played right now, are these toe of slopes or toe of continental slope plays. The Liza, the Piara, the Pacora, a smaller development. Also the discovery of Hammerhead. And then Jethro and Joe are discoveries by Tulo and the Tulo Hess Consortium. And you can see there's envisioned to be a myriad of Cretaceous prospects sitting out here, and then overlying younger tertiary prospects. The real story out here is going to be understanding migration picture, the timing of the different productions of different oil that are happening out in here. This Western province, I'm going to expand a little more on that. I mentioned Jethro and Joe, and those are these prospects over to the western side of Guyana. That Jethro and Joe, as I said, was drilled by Tulo and their partner Hess, and they may partner with someone else. I'm just not that familiar with it. But Jethro showed 55 meters of net oil. They also, Joe had 14 meters of net oil play in that discovery. And so what they've proven up is that this play extends not just from the area of Liza, but all the way over to the western side of Guyana. Right? They believe that they can estimate, a gross almost 4 billion barrels of oil equivalent in the blocks over on the western side of Guyana. I'll mention that I'm trying to work with the company in Trinidad to acquire a big 3D seismic survey, because I'm interested in the timing of sedimentation and the maturation and what's charging some of these Jethro and Joe plays over here. So we'll be doing some work out of Colorado School of Mines, hopefully, on some of that. And then if we spread from there all the way over to Suriname, this is a classic case of trendology with Apache coming in and drilling up some wells along with partners Total over in the eastern side of this trend. And they've also discovered quite a lot of hydrocarbons over in the Suriname area, which I'm really pleased with. I've probably done more work down in Suriname with Staatsolie, and they have always thought that there was a lot of prospectivity out there, and now they're seeing some return for their buck. So they estimate that there'll be a similar sort of type of operation and development for the Liza phase out in here for Total, and Apache that's going to cost about $7 billion. So they need a minimum recoverable resource of about 213 million barrels of oil equivalent at $56 a barrel. So these companies are going to be making some money down here, but you can see the huge cost of development. And that's why, going to these companies and asking in this environment for almost anything else is just beyond what they want to do, because their money is going in here. So let's talk about some of these, what I call slope ramp turbidite plays. The slope ramp turbidite plays, I was just talking about them. I'm sorry. The slope ramp turbidite plays that we were just looking at are really just the tip of the iceberg. So let's talk about some of the other plays that we're packing on around these slope ramp turbidite plays. What makes the basin work? This is a cross section that runs from west to east. That's done by a friend of mine, Ken Niblink, and a colleague, a former student of Frank's. Ken has spent, as I mentioned earlier, Ken has spent a lot of years looking regionally at the hydrocarbon systems all up and down the Atlantic margin, and he's been working on this area with a company out of Dallas that's partnered with a company out of England. And they're going to be drilling some wells out in the Kanje block, I think, later this year. But one of the things that this cross section shows you is the prolific nature of source rocks out in here. This is the Guyana uplift over here. And as you come across here, you sink that basin. Probably, people have speculated this big, sink in the basin is somehow influenced by, as I said, that older transform margin that was opening up the Atlantic back pre-Cretaceous, back in the Jurassic time. But I'll show you some seismic across here. We can talk about that in a minute. Then you come up to the east onto this Demerara plateau, this uplifted margin that I mentioned a while ago, and you get over into Suriname, and here's the Jurassic. The Jurassic and Neocomian sort of carbonate platform all the way over to the deposits off of Brazil's Amazonian areas, right? So you have a series of wells, not a huge amount of wells, but you can see the success of Ranger, Lisa, Skipjack, all these wells that are being successful here in the Burbees play. There are two source rocks. There's an OAE1 source rock, an OAE2 source rock that gets mapped across this margin. And I think that, and I agree with him, that combined with these big river systems, what we call the Demerara back in the Aptian, the Burbees in the Upper Cretaceous, and the Amazon and the Miocene Pliocene, are burying these source rocks and causing different phases and times of expulsion across the basin. So you have well-established source rocks, you have high sediment supply that's coming in at varying times in the basin, structural stratigraphic traps, and then you have a market and infrastructure proximities that make this a nest of elements across here. Here's a line, a section that's looking across that basin. So this sort of follows offshore. This is Hermiston's look, and you can see some of these deeper plays, like in the Demerara, where you're getting these deeper reactivated structural plays, and these haven't even been drilled or touched out here. Then if you come back over to the west, in addition to these classic plays, there's a play like Ranger, and Ranger was a discovery by Tulo and Hess, one of the ones that I mentioned. It wasn't even the Jethro or the Joe discovery. This was a completely different discovery called Ranger, and Ranger was a carbonate bay opener. There are clearly these little carbonates, mounds and carbonate platforms that are built over the top of what people think are these intrusive bodies that are building these carbonates. And, Ranger had 230 feet stacked high quality oil bearing carbonate reservoirs. So there's another play out here that's barely been touched. Another carbonate margin buildup out here that has barely been touched is are these reefs and carbonate buildups that appear to be happening on top of and slightly younger than the basement rocks. So you have these possible Albian carbonate buildups that you see out in the margin. This is a cross section from Guyana going across the Liza seismic section and out toward Liza Field. They're very similar in nature probably to Some of the stromatolitic or the carbonate buildups that we see forming in Brazil in the subsalt. You have these. Here's an image from some of the Brazil work showing sort of recent or more modern stromatolitic buildups, and here's a likewise image in the East Campos Basin showing some of these more ancient buildups that are pre-subsalt. That's probably very close to what you have here. These are equivalent in time to the carbonate buildups that we see in Brazil. These tend to be these can form either from reefs or carbonate stromatolites, right? Or detrital carbonate rocks that are sort of reworked shell and chemical precipitates. You can also get some abiotic precipitation of carbonate chemical buildups, but you need volcanic or hydrothermal episodes to build these, like travertines and things. So there's been some work done on these, similar to the Tengiz field over in Kashagan and the Kashagan complex over in the North Caspian basins. And here's the Libra buildup, the Libra field in the Santos Basin. So colleagues have been working these and looking at some of these for a while. So these have barely been looked at or touched out here. What I said, the Ranger discovery that we mentioned in that carbonate buildup, a Hess exploration manager suggested that it's possible that they're building or developing on top of extinct Jurassic basement volcanoes. Okay, so that can give you a clue, a little bit of a clue to what is in people's minds in terms of the carbonate types or carbonate reservoir types. These could be some of these abiotic, or they could be biotic carbonate buildups out here. All is not roses offshore. It never is. If it were all roses, we'd all be rich. There was a prospect called the Marcel that was drilled fairly recently, and Marcel Oil, I shouldn't say, drilled the Amalia prospect that was drilled fairly recently, and it was hoped to be about 500 million barrels of oil, but it was a dry hole. This really hit the drilling companies, which was Tullow, really hard. They thought that possibly it was a breach of the seal. There is some suggestion that there's some seals in here that don't allow hydrocarbon migration into some of these Carapa or these Amalia prospects up in here. The Carapa was similarly P&A'd, and just in January 2020, it had only 3-meter oil leg. So really not the resources to drive things. So there's still a lot of work to do in here, looking at the timing and the migration picture and the seal reservoir picture across this basin. The thing that interests me probably the most about this area are the huge geomorphic systems that characterize these basins. I thought that I knew about the drainage basins that were built and developed across this basin when I was looking at the Orinoco and the Amazon. But that just scratched the surface. Down in the Cretaceous, there are multi-continent scale drainages across Northeastern South America that very little mapping or very little work has been done on. We actually put in a proposal. I put in a proposal about 1.5 years ago to go and do some detrital zircon work to prove that the Burbees drainage system, whose sort of premise is shown here in these images, that the Burbees deltaic drainage system was actually hosting and draining. It was a continental scale drainage system that was draining the Proto-Amazon drainage basins. That didn't get funded, but nevertheless, it doesn't keep us from talking about it. So these are some images from Ken's work that he presented recently down in Northeastern South America, showing that there is an older Demerara deltaic system that's being fed by that separation and that rifting of South America from northwestern Africa. And there's probably huge turbidite complexes and deltaic complexes that are sitting off in the older sections out here, still down into the Tethys Ocean. At this point, the Burbees drainage system was relatively minor. And then as we move into the Turonian, the Upper Cretaceous, we see the Burbees system really beginning to develop and spill out into the deeper parts of the Suriname and Guyana Basin. We're going to look a little bit more detail at the Burbees Canyon in a minute. And it's draining a huge part of South America across the Santonian, Cenomanian Shell. And then eventually we get a relaxation of the rifting and the rift margins that are separating South America and Africa. And with that relaxation, we began to see the Amazon capturing South American drainage, probably sometime in the Neogene, although there's still some question about that. Everyone used to think they knew the Amazon was a Miocene age system, but now we're not so sure that's true. We began to see huge volumes of sediment moved up into the basin, probably by the Guyana current. But I will tell you that this is about the time that the Orinoco system kicks up over here to the west. And one part of our interest in this is to look at some of the Orinoco system and see, its role in sort of burying some of the eastern side, western margins of Guyana, and compare and contrast some of the sediment that's moving in longshore current approaches to the Guyana current up in here to some of the more direct feeder systems of the Orinoco. It needs to be brought into the party. What happened were these two source rocks, when we began to bury this system, these two source rocks began to mature at different times. So we began to see the Burbees sediments maturing the OAE1 source rock across this basin. And once again, this is Niblink's observation. And then we began to see the lower tertiary, or what's believed to be lower tertiary or lower sedimentation, burying the OAE2 or the Turonian Conje source rocks across here. So two different source rocks, different big sediment sources coming across here at different times, burying these at different times, expulsion of hydrocarbons out here at different times in the basin. So some of this, as I mentioned, this success was set up partially, at least, by the ODP program. Companies and people had talked about being out here, and obviously Shell and Demex had drilled some wells down here and not have the success they want. I will say this: Shell, I think that Shell bagged out of their partnership with ExxonMobil about 9 months before Liza was drilled. And so Shell sold their interest, got rid of their interest. I think they sold it to Hess. And so somebody at Shell might be taking early retirement over that. But nevertheless, they had been burned out here, and there just wasn't the synergy and the energy to come out here and do anything. And then the ODP program came out in here and drilled sites 1260, 1261, 1259. There was an ODP leg that came out in here and drilled a bunch of wells out by the edge of the Demerara Plateau. Right, and here's a picture of the A2 well that was drilled. Here's the A2 well coming through here, and this wasn't drilled by ODP. They were sticking out in here. But what happened was they knew the A2 well had drilled some source rocks. Right, they had Cinnamanian and Turonian source rocks. They had Albion, but then they had Calovian source rocks as well. And the ODP leg came out in here and proved up these upwelling source rocks that were deposited at different times. So if we look at a seismic line across here, then we can see here's the Repsol block that I'm going to show you a little bit of detail in a minute. Down here's the deeper rifted stuff. Right, here are some of those big structures that are heavily faulted and fractured that have not been tested. And leg 177 drilled right off this Demerara uplift down in here. So we had a basin characterized by a lot of sediment, a basin characterized by structuring and post-depositional structuring and building of traps. And we had really rich source rocks across here. So it was just a matter of someone coming in with big pockets and drilling some wells out here, and eventually, and that's what ExxonMobil did. And Hess came in with them, and they had the first success out here, and they're reaping the rewards. When we came into the basin, Repsol was still active out here, and Repsol had a seismic data volume that was sitting, something like this, And Alan Keene and others gave us this data volume to come out here and look at and work. And so I was interested in the river systems across here. And so this was perfect for me because as I'll show you, it is an amazing cross-shelf incised canyon or incised valley system. This lasted until about a year ago we were working on this with a master's student and some other people, and she had already put her master's thesis out, and Repsol didn't seem to have a lot of interest in the area. And then I was down for a meeting at Repsol's offices, and I was talking to them because I was always trying to convey them what we were doing. And a guy walked into the meeting, and he said he was carrying a fax, and he laid it down. He said, Tulo just had a discovery at Ranger. And you could feel a palpable cooling going out over the entire room. It was almost palpable. You could almost taste the change in the attitude in the room. And it wasn't a few weeks after that I got an email from Repsol saying, cease and desist any work that you're doing on the Burbees data. And please, only don't publish don't put out anything more than you've already put out in the master's thesis and the work that you've done, and please don't work the data anymore. So, and we're always respectful of that. We understand there's a huge amount of money involved. So everything that you're going to see from here on out is work that was included in Uju's master's thesis, and maps and things that were built in association with Uju's master thesis. So now that we've talked about the elephant, or the elephants out here, let's talk a little bit about the elephant's trunk. Okay, and so the elephant's trunk is what I call the Burbees cross shelf incised valley. That is a huge system that's feeding all this sediment out into the basin and maturing these, not only depositing the reservoirs, but helping to bury and mature the OAE1 source rocks out here, so that we can charge them with hydrocarbon. One of the big plays that we haven't talked about here is what I call the canyon play. And here you can see the Burbees, or it's called the Kanuku 3D seismic survey that sets in here. It's about 8,000 square kilometers of seismic data. And one of the things that Alan Keene said whenever he gave it to us was, you may have to break it apart, because I don't know if you have the software or the server to work this type of data. Well, let me tell you, Colorado School of Mines has the software and the server and the desire to work these type of data sets. So you can't really do these large scale seismic geomorphologic studies without being able to look at these sort of source distinct systems. So we were all over this. This seismic line that's going right, the upper seismic line goes right down the middle of the canyon that I'm going to show you. And you can see in the bottom image, which goes across the canyon, it's sort of where is, I should have put it on here. I'll get in trouble from Frank for not having that cross section on there. This is the B to B prime cross, or the A to A prime cross section in the bottom. And you can see this big incision that comes across that whole shelf. This is what I call the shelf incised valley of the Burbees. And one of the things that I want you to notice is this isn't just an incision that's starting up here and coming down and cutting through. This isn't just one phase of incision. This is actually a persistent, a repetitive incision process that happens between the basal surface here, the purple surface, and then I1, I2, I3, I4, I5 are all subsequent episodes of incision reoccupying the same area through this valley. So we'll look at the size of these incisions, but if we take a line right down the middle, you can see that this basal incision in orange is filled with multiple phases of huge sets of prograde incliniforms coming right down the axis and sometimes from the sides of this big incised valley system that's developed out here in the Kanuku block. And then overlying the top of it is this more direct feed system where we have the Guyana current and different things feeding sediments off the shelf in the tertiary. So there are two main ways of delivering sediments sort of basinward of the shelf, all right? And I call these, I look at these two different ways of delivering sediments, and I see examples of them all over the world. Right? So here's the Equatorial Guinea margin of West Africa. I'm ashamed to say I don't have the reference for this, but I think I got this from Fisher. Fisher and I talk about these things all the time, and so I'll credit Fisher with some of these ideas here. But you know, there are systems that prograde right out to the margin and they feed directly off into the slope and the deep water areas. And then there are systems that cross-cut across the top of the shelf system, and they feed sediments through a point source out into the deeper water areas. If we look at an example of this cross-shelf type of system, the modern California margin, the Monterey Canyon and associated, they call this the canyon, but in reality, this is a cross-shelf feeder system that goes up into Moss Landing, and sediments are fed directly across the shelf. So when I lower base level on this system, I wouldn't see a prograde high stand out in here. I would see sediments prograding right down the middle of that canyon. Here's a really good paper by Frode Hadler Jacobsen and his colleagues at Staubrook. They're not Staubrook anymore, they're Equinor, in eastern offshore Brazil. And this is beautiful data. And this is the timing of this cross-shelf feeder system is almost perfectly timed with what we see going on in the Burbees Guyana margin area. So there were a series of these cross-shelf feeder systems that were tapping right back up into the shelf systems or the shoreline systems of the Cretaceous and feeding fan systems setting off of the shelf. This one happens to be off of Brazil. We're going to look at an example of one that was sitting off of the Guyana Suriname margin. So if we look in Guyana and Suriname, both of these types of feeder systems occur. On the right, you can see this direct feeder system that's sort of what I call collapse enhanced, coming off Demerara Plateau of the Suriname area and feeding right down into that collapse. So the deltaic system is prograded right up to the margin, and it's just shedding sediments in almost a line source out into what's called the Demerara Swamp. And then you see this example of this cross-shelf sized valley system in the Burbees, where you're feeding right off into the deep water area, but your valley system is cutting across the shelf and tapping right back into the marginal beach systems or the shelf systems of the Guyana margin. Now this sets up, this type of topography at your shelf margin sets up a lot of processes that are active when you get direct river feed systems pouring down into steep topographic margins. This includes what we call hyperpigmental river discharge. So in the Cretaceous, remember, we had a super greenhouse environment in the Cretaceous. We had, tropical environments. We had massive storms that were hitting margins. We had these sudden bursts of outflow coming out that were pushing out hyperpigmental river discharges. You also get homopigmental plumes that are sedimenting off into these environments. So I'm going to show you where you have huge 300-meter cliniforms building within this canyon system, and all these sediments are moving over these 1,000-foot sharp drops, feeding sediments off into these slope areas. And that sets up a lot of sedimentation of hyperpigmites. So how big were these canyons? How big was the Burbees Canyon? Well, the Burbees cross-shelf incised valley was as big as most of the modern and ancient canyon systems that we map around the world. There's a really good publication by Whiteway, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but Whiteway and Harris in 2015. It was timely because Uju went and looked up and sort of compiled a lot of information on these big modern canyon systems around the world. And you can see each one of these triangles represents a phase of incision in the Burbees Valley system. And if we look at the oldest phase of incision to the youngest phase of incision, taken as an individual phase of incision, we're looking at something like the Congo, the Agadir, the Monterey Canyon systems. But if you add these all together additively, we have valley systems that are averaging 30 kilometers wide, and their stacked incision events are adding up to be larger than almost anything that we see in the modern record. If we go to the ancient record, things like Chicontepec, the Yoakum in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm just showing a few examples here, the Princeton, the Williams, Manos, the phases of sedimentation are much wider than anything that we see in the ancient record, right? So we have this huge incised cross-shelf valley system, and when we began to stack those events together, the total volume of sediment, the total size of the Burbees feeder system is larger than anything that we see in the ancient record and the modern record. Well, this is funny because whenever I was talking to Alan Keene about this data, Alan said, I want to give you this data. You guys can work on this data. There's a valley in this data that's bigger than, it's the biggest valley ever on the earth. And I said to him, I said, well, how big are valleys on the earth? How big are these canyons on the earth? And he said, well, I don't know, but this is the biggest one ever. I was like, so the first thing we did was we began to look at how big was this thing compared to other systems or other analog systems. It is, if I look at the modern Grand Canyon, I could envision the Burbees Canyon looking similar to this system, but sitting out in a shelfal environment, right, in a cross-shelf environment. And look at the complexity of the modern Grand Canyon. This is the type of complexity that you get in these huge mega canyon systems. And so can you imagine trying to move sediments in river systems through this type of thing and filling this up? So now I'm going to show you some images where you fill this thing up and then you re-incise it and you fill it up and you re-incise it and you fill it up and you re-incise it. And you do this about 6 times in the Burbees Canyon system. The timing of this canyon system, we think it's likely that it's sometime within the Coniacean and Santonian, but the major incision was occurring probably during Santonian time. There's some evidence of an older canyon, that sort of late Albian incision, but we think it was probably dominantly Santonian. On the shelf in the areas around Guyana, there's some well penetrations, and we're missing, as we move over towards the canyon in the North Coroni well, we're beginning to see erosion, and we're missing the whole upper Santonian, Turonian, Coniacean section. So there's, and then the other line of evidence for the timing of this is there was a really good piece of work or paper done by Webster, and Webster presented this at the 2020 consortium, the 2020 AAPG meeting that was online in September, and you can find his extended abstract on there. And he's a co-worker with Ken Nimblink, and they presented this talk on the Tucutu Graben, right? And he had done some work, I think, with a company in Dallas, I'm not sure, but he had access to Hunt Oil's seismic lines and some of the information from the turret sink well in the Tucutu Graben. And he could time this thing when it was coming through the Tucutu Graben as feeding this drainage into the Guyana offshore, right? So there's also information, and I'll show you an image within the Tucutu Graben. Here's a small map. But you can see that within the Tucutu Graben, there's evidence for marine incursion into the Tucutu Graben during the Cretaceous time period. So he believes that, oops, let me put this. So Webster in his 2020 paper in AAPG, he believes that the Tucutu Graben probably had a restricted marine embayment that linked it, that proved this sort of linkage between the offshore Guianan area and the areas of the Guianan Shield, right? So he believes that the Tucutu Graben extends northward into the Guianan area and the Burbees Canyon area through this extended Mesozoic graben system. Now then, if we can make that linkage, sure, there's a lot of questions that remain, but there's no doubt that there was a Paleo-Burbees river that was draining into the Guyana Basin. When I looked at this valley that I'm going to show you, I looked at it and said, there's no way that this is not being cut by a continent scale drainage system. It's just impossible. Because if you look at this thing, it is 1,200 meters deep, and then it fills, And then here's a high stand deposit out here on the margin. And then it's another 750 meters deep. And then it fills, likely fills, 750 meter incision again, and then another incision. I mean, this is multiple phases of the system coming in and cutting 1,200 meter, 750 meter deep incision inside valley. There are 6 major phases of cut and fill, possibly a deeper one, like I said, in the Albion. But the erosion on each one of these phases isn't equal. The amount of erosion actually decreases from the basal erosional surface up to the shallow erosional surfaces, and I'll show you that. So here's a seismic line down through that. Here's the basal Albion unconformity, all right? And then here's our basal B1 unconformity. And then if we look down the center, there's the I1 unconformity, there's the I2 unconformity, there's the I3 unconformity, the I4 unconformity, and then there's 5, and finally the final flooding surface of the Burbees Canyon. So what's happening is the system is erosional and bypassing early in its history, and then it's becoming more aggradational and progradational as these huge deltaic cliniforms come down the system and begin to fill it. In the early phases, you can see that there's erosion happening in the B1, or the basal surface, the I1, the I2, and even the I3. They thin down to nothing, and then there's sort of a bypass of these cliniforms, probably muddy toe sets of these cliniforms, before you get out into what I call the jaguar fan out in here. Look at some of the architecture of this valley. This is the basal surface, right? We've got the basal erosional surface. In the head, we've got multi-bifurcating architecture. And then I'm going to show you these cuspate erosional surfaces in the western wall versus these gullied surfaces in the eastern wall of the canyon. And then finally, we'll look at some of the real steep drop-offs as we get into the toe-continental slope and the depositional plain. Here's the bifurcating head of this thing. This is a proximal basal surface that's collective. I mean, it's collective in that it has these different smaller things that are collecting together. This is not a cuspate-shaped subaqueous failure process that's going on here. You know, people say, well, what's forming this? Oh, well, you know, it's probably retrogressively failing as it goes back through there. No, that's not what's happening. I can't tell you exactly how this thing is forming, but there are definitely drainages that are draining into half this canyon. And they're coalescing down valley into a single axial channel. If we look at this central portion of this valley, we can see that on the eastern side of this valley system, we have a series of drainages, even bifurcated drainages, that are moving down into the lateral margin of this valley. In contrast, on the western side of this valley, we have these cuspate architectures that appear to be undercut and slumping material down into the margin of this valley. We believe this scalloped edge is actually a product of possibly littoral sediment supplies, but also littoral currents that are hitting the lateral margin of this valley and undercutting the western side of this valley margin. This is why we also feel we have progradation of some deltaic cliniforms from the eastern and southeastern parts of this valley into the lateral margins of the valley. If we move on out to the more terminal regions of this valley, we can see that we have really sharp topographic features that change within the mouth of the valley. The flows going over some of these topographic features have to be going from supercritical to subcritical. And what's happening is as they do that, they're prompting, they go from supercritical to subcritical. They can't carry their sediment anymore. And so they dump the sediment as they move across that topography. And some of the reservoirs that we see in some of the fields, like Lisa, suggest that this transform from supercritical to subcritical flow from within the valley and also at the lateral opening, the end of the valley, are responsible for some of these reservoirs. If we look in a little more detail at a couple of these packages now, let's zoom in on the I3 package to the I4 package. You're really focused in on this package to look at the cliniform architecture that's confined within this valley. The slope foreset, the foreset heights of cliniforms within the I3 to I4 package was almost 300 meters high. Some ranged from 300 meters all the way down to 100 meters high. The average was 278 meters high. Think about that. This is a 300-meter high cliniform within the confines of a 1,250-meter deep valley, okay? The foresets ranged from almost a half a degree to up to almost 5 degrees in some cases. 5-degree foresets, 3.5-degree foresets, those are the type of foresets that stabilize with coarse-grained sand sediments. Just as a timeout, I'm going to tell you my pig's awake. And so if you hear something in the background, it's Bartley going outside. Okay. So those type of percentages on your foreset slopes suggest that these are sandy types of foresets, right? Muddy foresets are much lower, you know, 1/10 of a degree, but these are all fairly steep foreset slopes. The individual the total cliniform heights of these are well over 300 meters high, all right? So at any given time, cliniforms within that Burbees Canyon were generating in water depths of over 100 to 1,300 meters deep, all right? So there is a lot of supercritical to subcritical flow processes probably going on over these cliniforms. This creates a really sort of a unique type of sand system. And I'm not going to go into this in detail, but there's been some really good work done by Mike Clare and his group and some other people looking at the Squamish River Basin up off of Nova Scotia and off of Canada, looking at what happens when you take a delta and you push it out and suddenly it falls over a 100-meter lip, right, off into deep water. What you end up with are these type of sandy deposits, these big, thick, sort of backwardly migrating, you know, supercritical to subcritical transform sandy deposits. This has been modeled by some work up in St. Anthony's Falls. You get sediments falling over these big cliniforms in supercritical flow, and then as they bottom out, the flow goes subcritical. And what happens is when it goes subcritical, you begin eroding and you begin depositing, and you actually get a series of cliniforms at the toe that are moving back in the opposite direction. That's why they look like this. This is a great paper. Just look up Squamish River, Michael Clare, and there's some videos on there, and you can watch these things dumping huge sand volumes back into the areas around the Squamish River. And we believe that's probably what's happening out here as these flows go over these really supercritical, subcritical topographies. If we map those different basal cycle surfaces of the basal cycles of each one of these, you can see the early basal surface with these scallops and gullies. And then here's the next surface up. We're still seeing some scalping, that really beautiful bifurcated head. By the time we began to get up into the I2, we're seeing some really interesting lateral incisions in here. Probably deltaic progradation and lateral incisions coming into the head of that feature. Then we're beginning to fill the thing. We're still getting lateral incisions. We're still seeing some lateral incisions in here, all right? Oh, I just busted myself out of that. How did I do that? Ah, there we go. So we're seeing lateral incisions. We're seeing, by the time we get up into I4 and I5, we're beginning to fill this thing. These are just some isopack maps to show you the size and the depth of the fill packages in here. Here's the lowest surface is 20 kilometers wide with 1,200 meters of fill. Then 30 kilometers wide with 1,250 meters of fill. 27 kilometers with 1,250 meters of fill. All these 29 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 33 kilometers. We're widening this fill package as we get up shallower. but we're shallowing the fill package. So there have got to be, and you can see in this image specifically, you can see that there have to be lateral littoral currents in the mid-Cretaceous. They're bringing sediments impacting the fill of these incisions because we're getting this architecture along the eastern margin where we're filling these things. Here's a good example here. Here's another example here. So I think everyone is probably in agreement. We've got these littoral lateral margin fills. As I said, if we look at any one of these incisions, it's transporting a huge amount of sediment in the basin. But if taken in whole, total, there's a huge volume of sediment that's moving out into this basin. This was some work that was done with Uju. Zane Joe, my colleague out at School of Mines, very good sedimentologist, stratigrapher, worked with Uju to sort of calculate some of these volumes, look at the volumes. This isn't that, 20 to almost 21 metric cubic tons per year of sediment that's going out into the system. So people always say, I get in these discussions with Nicholas Atwood and with Tim Demko, and we would say, how is this incision being cut? What is the process that's cutting and recutting this incision? And I still don't know the answer to that. This is not being driven by sea level. I mean, sea level would have to fall 1,200 meters to get this type of incision in a subaerial environment. However, we can see these big deltaic cliniforms prograding in this thing. There is a possibility. Obviously, people look to this and they say, oh, well, you're getting slumping at the mouth of this feature. You're getting slumping at the margin, and then that just headwardly erodes this thing backwards. I have a problem with that, cutting something 1,250 meters deep, 100 kilometers. I didn't tell you that. This thing is extending 100 kilometers off the shelf margin. I mean, it's one thing for this to be, I showed you an example of the Monterey Canyon, but the Monterey Canyon does it 100 kilometers across the margin. This is a process that has to maintain itself for 100 kilometers and cut something 1,250 meters deep. And I don't know what that is. Is it possible that there's some drainage outbursts or things going on? Sudden stream captures of things? Probably, yeah. So I'm still out on how this thing is forming. I am not out, however, on believing that there's a huge drainage basin that's feeding this system and it's coming across the margin, right? I know we're running out of time, so I only have a couple of more slides of this. So there's a huge Cretaceous age drainage system that's feeding the Lagos Amazonas. It's coming out of Lagos Amazonas. There's some really interesting work by Lujan and Armbruster done on fish species to show that there's connections between these drainage systems and the Amazon drainage basin. There's also some work that's done looking at Devonian age polynomorphs that are only outcropping in the Amazonian drainage basin and that are found in the sediments offshore. So there's a lot of suggestion that these are linked. So some of the summary observations, the axis of this valley shifts to the northeast over time. I don't know why. There's a progressive widening of the incision. The eastern side of this valley looks like it's modified by constructional activities or deltas building into it. The western margin appears to be more scalloped and eroded. It's a complex process of how this thing is forming and filling and forming again and filling again. This is a unique, I do think this is a unique system across the world. And in this Cretaceous time, which was a very unique time in terms of environments of deposition, things that were going on. And this system is building across a shelf and directly feeding opportunities off into this very unique basin that's setting off here. Processes that are going on, the topography within the valley system encourages this supercritical to subcritical flow. There are probably, plays within this valley that have been explored where you get separation or hydraulic jumps across some of these features within these valleys, that you're getting isolated deposits within the valley that offer up the type of opportunity or prospectivity. Plus with cliniforms that are 3.5 degrees, then that needs to be explored. We need to explore the architecture of these cliniforms to see what they're composed of. So in terms of concluding observations with the Burbees, it's a huge system, all right? It's moving 20 metric tons a year of sediment out onto the basinward fan. The formation of mechanism for the complex, I don't know. That's a good question. It's possible that there's stratigraphic traps within the valley and the canyon itself because of all the complexity of the valley and the hydraulic jumps that are happening within the canyon itself. It's being fed by a Cretaceous age continental stratal drainage that's coming through the Takuta Graben probably to the northeast of the continental margin, feeding the offshore. If we look at opportunities, where are the next elephants coming from in this basin? There are opportunities within the rift plates that are actually within shallow water today, but are buried quite deep that need to be explored. There are probably Tethyan, deltaic, and fan systems that are setting off in the Tethys South America Delta fan system, offshore Guyana, offshore Eastern Guinea or Western Guinea, that offer opportunity and are very deep in this section down in here. If you look at the image down low, you can see the carbonate sort of isolated buildups or margin buildups that need more exploration. The Lisa discoveries are only one type of discovery out here. It would probably behoove us to dig into these 3.5 degree slope cliniforms that are 300 meters high within this canyon or valley system that we see within things like the Burbees, and there are some smaller canyons too. So we've barely touched the surface of the elephants that are sitting out here in this basin. I want to thank you guys for the opportunity to talk about this. You can tell I get excited about this area. I think it's because I thought I knew stuff out here, and I really know quite a bit less than I thought I did. I want to shout out again to Ken Niblink and Webster and the guys that have been working out here. We share a common interest in the geomorphology out here. Bob Ehrlich, Tim Demko, Bill Fisher, Nick Atwood, Eric Scott, and all the others who, especially my students, Sebastian Cordon and Uju, who have done quite a lot of work out here. And thanks to Repsol, who have enabled some of this research, and for us to get into the new opportunities to sit out here to better understand the Cretaceous, as opposed to focusing just on the tertiary, which has been sort of my career. I'm really interested in digging into the Cretaceous out here. So thanks, guys, for your patience.